The 46th SADC Summit is now entering its final stretch at the Inkosi Albert Luthuli International Convention Center in Durban, with regional leaders expected to wrap up discussions on key priorities facing the Southern African region. President Cyril Ramaphosa, as we've been telling you, is due to deliver the closing address as the bloc looks ahead to implementing the decisions taken at this year's summit. What you're seeing there is inside the venue where the closing ceremony will take place. But for now, let's take you to SABC News anchor Oliver Dickson and specialist correspondent Sophie Mokoena. They join us now live from Durban. So around this time, Oliver, I do imagine that you guys are sniffing around and, you know, all around the corridors and interacting with various diplomats and members of delegations and trying to suss out what has come out. What are you hearing about the final outcomes, the possible final outcomes, what's being discussed, and possible commitments that could potentially come out of this summit?
Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. Well, everyone is mum at this point, right? As you would imagine, most of the dignitaries and diplomats are still engaged in that closed session. We know moments from now we expect the closing ceremony to start, which in order of sequence will begin by a signing of the legal instruments of the SADC heads of state and government. Following that will be the induction of the new Deputy Secretary of SADC, very specifically on regional integration. Then we will hear from President Cyril Ramaphosa in his closing remarks. In fact, first we'll hear from the Executive Secretary, Mr. Mokoena. Then we'll hear from President Cyril Ramaphosa from his closing remarks. And then later on, we will be addressed by the President, President Ramaphosa, follow alongside Minister Ronald Lamula and the Executive Secretary, Elias Mokoena, in a media briefing where we hope to get a lot more details out of it. But we have a sense of what's top of mind. Earlier on, myself and SABC News specialist correspondent Sophie Mokoena were in conversation with Vincent Magwenya, and the conversation around industrialization, regional integration, and the authorization of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is an important part for President Cyril Ramaphosa and seems to be what will be the defining contours of his chairpersonship. In fact, he addressed it in large part in his speech earlier on. I want to play you this clip to us. This is what President Ramaphosa had to say around the economic health of the region and its 16 member states. Have a listen at this.
Today, our task is to give economic and social meaning to that political liberation. We are a community of 16 nations and more than 430 million people, with a GDP that is edging towards $1 trillion shortly.
Well, that is what he had to say on economic integration, very specifically around trade and industrialization, right? It's a big feat. It's an economy of 16 nations comprising of 400 million people as its population size approximately. And we're looking at an economy that's almost 900 billion in GDP, US dollars that is. So we're not talking about a small region on the continent. In fact, quite an important region on the continent, but small in relative global terms. And we have to sort of unpack that. To what extent, Sophie Mokoena, can we expect President Ramaphosa to advance the question on the economy of the region the same way he did at the G20 summit? At the G20 summit, you know, he was quite boisterous around the idea that Africa and its member states must be able to have a conversation with the global north around debt restructuring. Zambia, of course, underwent debt restructuring itself as a member state of the region after defaulting on its debt. But more importantly, on preferential trade agreements with one another on the continent. Some of our biggest trading partners exist in the region with us. To what extent can we expect that to be the defining principle of his chairpersonship?
That will be the focus, because as you heard when he was delivering his speech, he traced the origin of SADC to the issue of solidarity that was early when it was still SADC. But later when it was transformed to SADC in 1992, the focus was clear. It was about economic integration. And therefore, since 1992, this has been an issue. What he has to do is to leverage on the political will of many heads of state in the region who have accepted that to avoid a situation where you see instability in their respective countries, you have to address the economic growth, but also job creation and focus on the youth, the people who form a large number of the population of the region. And therefore, the issue of the economy will be a main issue. He has started, you know, in South Africa, that is his focus. If you ask him what makes you not to sleep at night, he has often mentioned the fact that it's the challenges of the economy. It's not growing in a way that it could really bring returns. And I think he's fully aware that you can have a better economic growth in South Africa if other countries, the neighboring countries, are also doing well.
Yeah.
Because then you can work with them. As I pointed out earlier on, our largest trading partner in Africa, not only in SADC, is Mozambique, our neighbor. It's not only the largest trading partner in terms of the region and the continent, but globally it's ranked amongst a high number in terms of trade between South Africa and Mozambique, the trade volume. And therefore, if Mozambique is not doing well, we are going to be affected. And we know we're sitting with a massive problem of the economy that's not growing in such a way that you can see improvement and you can change the lives of South Africans.
Yeah. So one of the numbers that President Ramaphosa cited there, he said that the economy of the region in 2025 grew by 3.4% approximately. Now, that is true, but South Africa didn't grow by any stretch of the imagination close to that. In fact, our growth was around hovering at about 1%. That means our peers in the region economically are doing better than us. That's how we got to that average, that there are economies in the region growing faster than us and are industrializing in ways that are quite important, which benefits us as perhaps the most industrious economy in the region. But there are still bottlenecks around unlocking supply chain optimization, still bottlenecks around optimizing the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. What seems to be the blockage for a lot of these aspirations that year after year it becomes defined as part of the SADC Vision 2050?
In fact, even he himself did say that as much as the economy of the region grew by 3.4%, it's not fast enough. Even if you look at the overall growth, it's still not high enough to be able to unlock the potential that we are speaking about. I think part of really the bottlenecks that hinder this kind of growth is part of what the president has said as the priorities. Look at our infrastructure. Remember, if our economies are to integrate and do well, we have to have the infrastructure in place to be able to deal with that. So by infrastructure, we mean so many things. We mean physical infrastructure. We also mean the infrastructure, really, the digital infrastructure, given where we are now. So the issue of migration, the issue of inter-trade or intra-trade, so it's still a big problem. Yes, we are trading, as Sophie has pointed out, we are trading the biggest with our neighbors, but look at the kind of potential that could still be unlocked given the kind of resources and the materials that we have. So they have to, as the region, work on really connecting the region. So that's why the issue of developing infrastructure, the road network, is quite important. Whether it's energy, that infrastructure is quite important because it will simply unlock a number of opportunities in so many areas. I mean, earlier you were speaking about the critical minerals. So how do you then process some of the minerals when you have nothing, when all you have to do is to ship it out outside of the continent?
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of work to do there. So I would say, to your question, infrastructure development, massive investment in infrastructure will be one step to trying to unlock this huge potential this region has.
Yeah. Sophie, in the last 2 to 3 years, there have been a number of elections in the region where we've seen a change of guard, so to speak, right? We saw that happen in Botswana. We saw Namibia elect its first female leader. And so many of these leaders, heads of state who are here today, are relatively new, so to speak, to this idea of regional geopolitics, very specifically regional multilateralism. Does that shape the tone and texture of how the SADC summit has played itself out? Or is it, from your years of reporting on this, all but the same?
I think there's more expertise right now with this cohort of the leadership of SADC. I'll tell you why. When you look at Botswana, when you listen to what President Boko has been saying since he took office, you can understand, you can hear the tone that he has been following, you know, multilateralism. And as a legal person, he had to deal with lots of international law. He even went to school abroad. Therefore, he's familiar with the global arena and politics of the global arena. That is why he's very firm on issue of beneficiation, but also forming partnerships with countries that are developed to help with capacity and skills in terms of resources you need to industrialize. When you look at the president of Namibia, she is one of the previously long-serving foreign affairs ministers in the southern region, as the foreign affairs minister of Namibia. But also she was in exile in Tanzania. Yeah. She grew up in exile in Tanzania. And therefore, she is familiar with the global politics. That is why Namibia took a conscious decision to support South Africa at the International Court of Justice with that Israel case, because they are used to multilateralism, to support and to solidarity. Therefore, within the leadership, you have people who are quite familiar with these issues, whether you're talking about the president of South Africa based on the history of the party he comes from and what he has been doing even post 1994 behind the scenes on international matters, on mediation. So you have the people within the leadership of SADC who can assist in shaping a common position and common views at the multilateral level, even though the countries have a right to engage in bilateral talks. Like the president said, much as we are a community, we still respect the sovereignty of countries, and therefore you have that capacity.
Mzwandile, yesterday you noted something I think is very important, and that is the African Union, unlike the Southern African Development Community, has a peer review mechanism which has proven to be very instrumental in terms of how it measures progress. How do we measure success on a lot of these aspirations in the region?
Well, we do have to allow the leaders, or also as the citizenry, we should, I guess, have mechanisms to be able to measure some of the priorities that they have set. I mean, as we sit here, the president was clear what he wants to see achieved. And then at the end of his term, he should be able to indicate what is it that he was able to do, how far did he go, what were the problems where he couldn't. And then in that way, his colleagues must be able to also engage with him, because remember, so throughout this term, there will be continuous engagements, and then there will be issues that arise, and then how do they deal with those issues? I think when the leaders decide to be true to themselves by accounting quite honestly about things that they do for their people, it will be easier then to measure progress. But if it's just a mere speech, and then until the next summit, it's another speech, we will continue hearing about this issue. I mean, Sophie has just spoken about the issue of beneficiation. I don't know when I have been hearing that from leaders, even before President of Botswana. And then the question is, because someone like President Mugabe, for example, he has been very frank on this one. So what has been done between then and now? Because if there is no instrument to then measure that kind of progress, we will just regurgitate things that we know should be done. But of course, no one will account if they are not done. So get the systems in place, even if it's something similar to the African peer review mechanism, to check the progress, because that is what will get this region forward. We can't always be talking about we have huge mineral resources, we have this and that, but at the end of the day, you have nothing to show for it. So you've got to have a way to show that that which you have does benefit your people.
Yeah. Let's talk about, for a moment, silencing the guns, which is a theme not just for the region, but also for the continent. We saw post-election violence, all across Tanzania in their elections last year, right, which, have prompted investigations of political killings and now crimes against humanity coming out of there. But we've also seen post-election violence, when Daniel Chapo got elected as president of Mozambique. So these security questions are quite still prevalent for the region, albeit, as Mzwandile said earlier, relatively more stable compared to other regions on the continent. Relatively speaking, how big of a priority is that, Sophie, and to what extent do you expect President Ramaphosa to champion that vis-a-vis the other priorities that they might have?
The issue of peace and security must be a priority for any region on the continent. The example is West Africa. Not prioritizing the issue of peace and security has led to the insurgents that we see in the Sahel region. That has also contributed to movement of people, and that movement of people bring instability, because when people are moving to areas where there are already other people, then conflict start. And therefore, the failure to manage issue of peace and security led to that problem in the West Africa region, in the ECOWAS. We even saw the coups there. And therefore, SADC must understand that it is not immune to such challenges. And therefore, the peace, security, and political stability is quite important. Therefore, the organ on peace, security, and politics has to be very, very strong in terms of looking at the early warning systems. And as soon as you see those early warnings, you act, you don't wait. But the troika, the organ on politics, defense, and security, is as strong as the chair. If the chair of the organ, the country that is chairing the organ, is not strong enough and independent enough and committed to peace and security, then you will have problems. But also, if you have your own challenges in your own country, you are not going to be able to ensure that there's a synergy and people listen to you, because they'll point to your own weaknesses. And therefore, this organ is the most important part of the SADC. And the good thing about the organ, even though you don't have the African peer review mechanism, which is not a problem because all these countries, most of them, have signed up to the African peer review mechanism. We saw Zimbabwe signing up finally. The organ on politics, defense, and security must do its work, because when they have spoken, the summit adopts the recommendation. They are not
Yeah.
challenged.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. That's all we have time for right now. Moments from now, we expect that closing ceremony to start. And once it does, we'll bring that live to you. We expect to hear closing remarks from President Cyril Ramaphosa in that closing ceremony. But like I said earlier on, Tulas, the program had started this morning relatively late, 2 hours late. I don't know how much time had been caught back up during those closed-door sessions, if any at all. But like I did mention earlier, we anticipated that the closing ceremony will start much later than the initially indicated 6 p.m. Time on the program. So we'll give you updates on that as they do come through. But for now, Tulas, it's back to you.
Oliver, thank you for that. What a fascinating, a gripping conversation there with Oliver Dickson, Sophie Mokoena and Mzwandile Mbeje, just reflecting on some of the themes coming through from the SADC Summit. In fact, I'll ask the team to put up that QR code that was up just a moment ago, because I wanted to tell you a bit more about it. That's the QR code. If you can, scan it. Scan it now, scan it whenever you see it, because if you don't have SABC Plus downloaded, where have you been? What rock have you been living under? We've been having it. So scan that QR code and it will take you to SABC Plus. From there, you can then log in and navigate to the SABC pop-up channel about the SADC Summit, whose coverage is spearheaded by my partner, Bongiwe Zwane. You'll be glad you did. Scan that QR code and see what more you can get from SABC Plus.